name is Susan Roberts, and I welcome you to my presentation, Is Shakespeare Sir Francis Bacon? To have written the greatest works in English literature, the author displayed knowledge that has never been surpassed, and the identity of this universal genius, the man who ticks all the boxes, Sir Francis Bacon. Sir Francis Bacon, authorship theory. History of the Baconian Shakespeare. The first to openly infer in writing that Francis Bacon was the author Shakespeare were the Inns of Court lawyer poets Joseph Hall and John Marston, who, in an exchange of satires published between 1597 and 1598, refer to the author of the Shakespeare poem Venus and Adonis as Labeo, a jurist, who is also to be identified by the motto Mediocria Firma. The motto was the specific heraldic motto of Francis and Anthony Bacon at that time, but of the two, only Francis Bacon was a jurist. Many years previous to this, Bacon himself had written in a letter that he was a concealed poet, whilst his literary friend Toby Matthew had pointed out, also in a letter, that Bacon was known to the world under another name. Later, Ben Jonson, in his Discoveries, published in 1641, eulogized Bacon in the identical and unique way he had praised the author Shakespeare in the Shakespeare Folio, as he that hath filled up all numbers, etc. In 1679, Thomas Tennyson, afterwards Bishop of Canterbury, who published some of Bacon's unpublished writings in a collection called Baconiana, or Certain Genuine Remains of Sir Francis Bacon, referred to Bacon as having written under names other than his own. Almost a century later, in 1769, a book entitled The Life and Adventures of Common Sense, an historical allegory, was published anonymously. It claimed that a character called Wisdom, clearly identifiable as Francis Bacon, had made acquaintance with a person belonging to the playhouse and had commenced playwriting under the name Shakespeare. The earliest completely explicit suggestion that Francis Bacon was the author Shakespeare was made in 1781 by the Reverend James Wilmot, rector of Barton-on-the-Heath, a little village a few miles north of Stratford-upon-Avon. Being an avid researcher of Shakespeare, Reverend Wilmot failed to discover any significant evidence that the actor Shakespeare was the author of the Shakespeare works. However, what James Wilmot noticed was astounding similarities of diction, phrase, thought, opinion, and even error between the works of Bacon and those of Shakespeare, and he came to the conclusion that the real author must have been Francis Bacon. Reverend Wilmot's unpublished research was communicated to the Ipswich Philosophical Society by James Courton Cowell on 7th of February 1805. It was later deposited with the University of London Library, where it was discovered in 1932 by Professor Allardyce Nicholl. Gorhambury House, home of Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon's parents, or should it be foster parents? As we are all aware, lifestyle and upbringing of a child plays an important role towards their success in later years. Therefore, the Elizabethan household honed to Francis Bacon requires investigation. Firstly, background information on Sir Nicholas Bacon and his wife Lady Anne, and afterwards we will explore the possibility that they were but foster parents to Francis. Sir Nicholas studied at Cambridge University's Corpus Christi College. From there he went on to Gray's Inn, one of the Inns of Court, where talented and aspiring young gentlemen from Oxford and Cambridge learned law. It was also a sort of preparatory school for service in the royal court and in the administration of the government. He would go on to become Queen Elizabeth's Lord Chancellor, the highest legal position of the land, an office that Francis would someday hold himself. Lady Anne Bacon was the daughter of Sir Anthony Cooke, who was tutor to Queen Elizabeth's half-brother before he became Edward VI. Anne was a woman of keen intellect and strong Puritan views. She was well trained in Latin and Greek, and as the daughter of a tutor to the royal family, she received the education he would have given a princess. Lady Anne, Sir Nicholas's second wife, had a child, Anthony, born in 1558. He was 3 years older than Francis. From an early age, Anthony and Francis received schooling of the highest academic standard. Day-to-day life in the Bacon household started with family prayers and ended with stories of classical adventures, morality tales, and the ancient myths. Lord Keeper to Queen Elizabeth, Sir Nicholas was a sound lawyer and a witty man, revelling in classical literature. He was also a writer. However, a book he published had the result of excluding him from the Privy Council. Henceforth, he wrote anonymously. He not only saw the joy of writing a book, but he learned the value of being anonymous and the use of a pen name. In later years, Francis would have cause to follow his example. Please keep this in mind. In a letter written by Lady Bacon to her son Anthony regarding Francis, she makes this remarkable statement. "Explain to him, it is not my meaning to treat him as a ward. Such a word is far from my motherly feeling for him. I mean to do him good." Such a significant phrase reveals the real relationship of the Bacons. Francis was not their son. It is therefore quite consistent that Francis Bacon should write to Sir Toby Mathew and refer to Anthony as his friend, not as his brother. True, Francis signs the dedication of his essays to Anthony, "Your entire loving brother." But this is because in later life they were brother Masons and members of the Rosy Cross, the Rosicrucian Society. If Lady Anne and Sir Nicholas Bacon are foster parents, then who are Francis's biological parents? The Royal Secret. 1561 January. At this time, the chief lady in waiting to Queen Elizabeth was Lady Anne Bacon, wife to Sir Nicholas Bacon, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal. If a child were about to be born to the Queen, and such a birth had to be kept secret, would it not be natural for her to turn to Lady Bacon, her closest, intimate and greatest friend? To save the Queen's honour, and with the active connivance of Sir Nicholas, it would be most prudent for Lady Bacon to assume the role of mother to the royal child. Sometime in January, about 4 months after an alleged secret morganatic marriage, explanation later, of Elizabeth to Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, his wife Amy Dudley, née Robsart, having conveniently fallen downstairs to her death, Lady Bacon is supposed to have given birth to a child, and that child being known to history as Francis Bacon. However, facts seem to indicate that Francis was not of their flesh and blood, that the Bacons simply served in the capacity of foster parents. We can begin with this statement made by Dr. Rawley, published in 1657, 31 years after Francis's death. Dr. Rawley was Francis Bacon's chaplain, confidant, personal friend, and attendant. Francis Bacon, the glory of his age and nation, the adorner and ornament of learning, was born in York House, or York Place in the Strand. Rawley's opening statement that Francis Bacon was born in York House or York Place, he uses italics to draw attention to the phrase, is intended to provoke the reader to ascertain where Francis was born and who were his parents. For York House was the residence of Sir Nicholas Bacon, but York Place was the Queen's Palace, afterwards known as Whitehall. The statement begs the question, was Francis a Bacon born at York House or a Tudor born at York Place? The known facts. In January 1561, the Queen was in residence in York Place and had no public engagements or interviews. The 22nd of January is Francis Bacon's birthday. Registering the birth. An equally intriguing fact is that in the church at St. Martin's in the Fields, London, the baby is registered as Mr. Franciscus Bacon. The actual entry in Latin is on the first page of the book. However, someone in a different handwriting and in paler ink has added son of Nicholas Bacon. Now, why was the baby registered as Mr.? It was contrary to all customs of registration. Would his actual parents, if they were really Sir Nicholas and Lady Anne, be likely to dignify a baby with the title of Mr.? Sir Nicholas never recorded the birth of his other four sons in that way. It is impossible to think that such a prefix would ever have occurred to them had he been their own child. It is, on the contrary, easily understandable that if Francis Bacon were a young prince, his foster parents would seek to dignify the baby by giving him an extraordinary title as a covert mark of respect. Is it not significant that the entry in the church records is written firstly without the name of the father, then later a different hand in paler ink has added son of Nicholas Bacon? A further piece of intrigue. Francis was never entered in the family genealogy of Nicholas Bacon. Yet another piece of the puzzle as to the parentage. Sir Nicholas Bacon's will. We're jumping forward here. Sir Nicholas Bacon's will. In February 1579, Sir Nicholas Bacon died. He was a very wealthy man, being much in favour with the Queen, who had loaded him with money and presents. In December, only a few weeks prior to his death, he had made an elaborate will. After his death, the reading of his will disclosed he had left large sums of money to his children by a first wife, and a sufficient income for Lady Anne and her son Anthony. But the name of Francis was not even mentioned. Strangely, neither Lady Bacon nor indeed any member of the family expressed astonishment that Sir Nicholas's will made no monetary provision for Francis. Francis himself shows no surprise at the will's content and deeply misses Sir Nicholas. Can it be that Francis expects his inheritance to lie elsewhere? I will now explain the meaning of morganatic marriage. denoting a marriage in which neither the spouse of lower rank nor any children have any claim to the possessions or title of the spouse of higher rank. Here's an anecdote. When Queen Victoria was staying at Wilton House, the Earl of Pembroke informed her that in the muniment room was a document. It contained evidence that Queen Elizabeth was pregnant with Dudley's child, and that the two were secretly married at Wilton in 1560. Victoria demanded to see the document, and after reading it, threw it in the fire, saying, "One must not interfere with history." More evidence that Francis is not a member of the Bacon family. Sir Francis Bacon as a child. In this portrait, the child Francis is pictured holding an apple in his right hand, whilst his left hand covers his heart. No detail of good Renaissance painting was without an intended symbolic meaning. The apple is an age-old symbol of the fruit of knowledge. Note the child's rich dark brown or hazel eyes. Queen Elizabeth and her mother, Anne Boleyn, had similar eye colouring, as did Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, whereas Nicholas Bacon's family inherited predominantly grey-blue eyes, this being an important factor for later discussion. Around Francis's shoulders hangs a framed miniature painting suspended on a double chain. Why the double chain? Looking carefully, it would appear that there are two miniatures. The larger one almost conceals the smaller frame beneath. The most reasonable explanation for the miniatures is that they are intended to portray Francis's parents. Upon scrutiny, one sees that the top visible portrait is that of a bearded nobleman, possibly the father, whilst the portrait of a woman, possibly the mother, being someone hidden from view underneath. But why hide a portrait of the child's mother? Surely this would be an insult to the mother. On examination of the top miniature, it appears that the figure has a high forehead with bearded, narrow face and wears clothing much like that of a courtier soldier's. There is no resemblance to Sir Nicholas Bacon. Is it a depiction of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester? If this is correct, then it makes absolute sense as to why the portrait of the woman is practically concealed. Elizabeth would have been instantly recognised, and it was crucial to her keeping the throne that she maintained her Virgin Queen public image. Francis Bacon's eye colour. Francis was the only dark-eyed child in the Bacon family of blue-eyed and grey-eyed people. There is an entire family tree where one can see a reproduction that they are all obviously fair, and it is very rare for light-eyed people to produce a dark-eyed child. Professor Briscoe Ford, Professor of Genetics at Oxford, says that if Sir Francis Bacon had dark brown eyes and both parents had grey, the chance that he is fostered is very high. In the portraits of Elizabeth, her eyes are shown to be brown, black-brown or black. Robert Dudley's eyes are brown, though not as dark as Elizabeth's. His hair in all his portraits is very curly. Francis had curly hair, unlike the other Bacon sons. Between Elizabeth and Leicester, the characteristics to producing a child with dark eyes and curly hair are all there. Another feature of interest is Bacon's nose. There is a nose which exactly replicates Francis's, which is long but has a slight bulging of flesh at the tip. It can be seen in Holbein's portrait of Henry VIII. Francis, the Queen and Leicester, Francis growing up. Year after year, from 1565 to 1578, we find the Queen visiting the Bacon family at Gorhambury House, and Robert Dudley, knighted Earl of Leicester in 1564, almost always accompanied her. As such a regular visitor to the home of Sir Nicholas, it could be thought that Elizabeth was then able to supervise Francis's welfare and education. The boy's future was problematic. He had to remain a concealed child as to his real status. Francis, at about 5 years of age, was first taken to the royal court and, of course, would have been introduced as Sir Nicholas Bacon's youngest child. At the age of 13, following another visit of the Queen to Gorhambury House, Francis was sent to Cambridge University. Strangely, he did not go to St. Benet's College, where Sir Nicholas had been educated, but to Trinity College, founded by Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, and visited by Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, in 1564, the year he was knighted. Here Francis was placed in charge of Whitgift, the head of the college, who was made one of the Queen's private chaplains. After 2 years, 15-year-old Francis left the university to enter Gray's Inn, a law school.